Hello, good evening and welcome to this evening's lecture in the Trinity Long Room Hub's signature multi-annual series entitled Out of the Ashes, Collective Memory, Cultural Destruction and Recovery. This lecture is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. You're very welcome. My name is Peter Crooks. I'm a senior lecturer in medieval history in the Department of History in Trinity. And it has been my privilege for 3 years now to work with colleagues in the Trinity Long Room Hub in developing this series Out of the Ashes, which is generously supported by Sean and Sarah Reynolds. Out of the Ashes has been running now for 3 academic years since 2018, and its immediate inspiration and impetus came from our own national archival tragedy, the Four Courts fire, whose centenary falls next year, 2022, on June 30th. But our aim in developing this series was, as we move towards that centennial moment, to set the Irish experience of cultural destruction in the broadest possible global and historical context. This evening marks, I think, the 11th and penultimate event in this story, which across the last 3 years has taken us right back in time to antiquity, to the Library of Alexandria, the very first lecture, and forward into the perilous future of ephemeral digital archives. We've benefited from lectures with a genuinely global coverage. We've had speakers coming from Australia, India, who've covered topics including Iraq, Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as much closer to home, and Europe's dark and sometimes terribly recent experiences of cultural loss and cultural vandalism. Just as this series was commencing in the autumn of 2018, I can remember very clearly reading, as you will have done, with horror about the event we'll be hearing about this evening, the destruction in September 2018 of the National Museum in Rio. And we knew, even in that first lecture of the series, that this was a topic that we were going to have to address. I was enormously grateful to this evening's speaker, Professor Ana Lucia Araujo, for agreeing to join us in Dublin to discuss Brazil's experience and to set it in its deeper historical context, a story that really fits in all its complexity with the story of collection and destruction and recovery that we've been following and tracking across the last 3 years. I was even more grateful that Professor Araujo agreed to contribute despite the turmoil of the last 12 months. We would love to have you with us in Dublin to join the Long Room Hub in person, and that's something that we look forward to arranging in the future. Professor Araujo is a very distinguished historian. She comes to us this evening from Howard University in Washington, DC, where she's a full professor of history, and she really embodies interdisciplinarity in having doctoral degrees, both in history and social historical anthropology, as well as the history of art. She's very widely published on the history of the transatlantic slave trade, a topic of enormous interest, particularly in Trinity at the moment. Trinity, like many institutions, is exploring its own history as it relates to slavery. Her publications most recently include Slavery in the Age of Memory, Engaging the Past, published by Bloomsbury in 2020, and in 2015, Brazil Through French Eyes, a 19th Century Artist in the Tropics. Professor Araujo is a member of the International Scientific Committee of the UNESCO Slave Route Project and also serves on the editorial board of the American Historical Review. So we are extremely fortunate to have you joining us this evening for this lecture. After the main lecture, I'll be asking a friend of this series to deliver a brief response. You may remember, some of you who've been following the series, Lar Joy, who spoke in January 2020 in what seems like a very different world when we were able to assemble in Trinity in person and had a queue out the door and 400 people in the same room. I think that was the last time I saw anything like that. But we're very, very glad to have Lar back with us this evening to respond to the main lecture. Lar is the Port Heritage Director in Dublin Port, but he is also the former chair of the Irish Blue Shield and a member of the board of the Irish Museum Association. You will have your chance to have a say. Also, we're using the Q&A panel function within the Zoom webinar, so you can log questions there, and I'll make sure to bring them to the attention to our speaker at the end. You can also have your say on Twitter. The Twitter hashtag is hashtag Hub Matters, or use the Trinity Long Room Hub's handle at TLR Hub. And we'll try and bring as many of your questions to our speaker at the end of this session. But first, let's go to our lecturer for this evening, Professor Araujo, to discuss the death of the National Museum of Brazil, Slavery Heritage on the Edge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for the invitation. And I am very happy to be here today. I will start sharing my screen. Okay, and here we go. Perhaps you remember that day on the evening of Sunday, September the 2nd, 2018. A Facebook friend of mine posted an alarming news from the window of her apartment in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She could see the National Museum, Museu Nacional, on fire. A few hours later, the reports left no doubt. The museum had been destroyed. As I watched the news about the fire, all I could think about was the priceless articles, Africana articles, artifacts housed at the museum, which I had the opportunity of studying then about 12 years ago. The National Museum held 20 million items, a number several times larger than those held in European museums such as France's Quai Branly or the British Museum, as I pointed out in a tweet that same night, that same day. Then the history of the National Museum was indeed intertwined with Brazil's history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. The collection indeed reflected the role of Africa in shaping the country's history. Brazil imported indeed the largest number of enslaved Africans during the era of the Atlantic slave trade, nearly 5 million, men, women, and children, and did not abolish slavery until 1888, making it the last country to abolish slavery in the Americas. And Brazil also has the largest population of African descent outside Nigeria. We know that the formation of modern museums is also connected to the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. Of course, collecting objects intended for public or private display is a long-standing tradition developed around the world since antiquity, before the rise of what has been conventionally called colonialism. Royal palaces, for example, and temples in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas comprise the spaces designed to accumulate and conserve treasures, sacred artifacts, and also exotic objects. Sometimes these spaces were indeed open to public visitation, such as the royal palaces of Abomey in the former kingdom of Dahomey in present-day Republic of Benin that you see on this picture. But despite these early devices, the birth of the modern Western Museum coincided with West European oceanic expansion in the 15th century, indeed. Enlightenment and the development of scientific knowledge propelled travels across the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Oceans, leading then to European exchanges with other human groups and the conquest of Asian, African, and American territories. Then the development of the Atlantic slave trade, slavery, and the colonization of the Americas in the 15th century are also linked to the emergence of modernity and the birth of modern Western museums. For example, the British Museum opened in 1753 at the height of the Atlantic slave trade, and it drew from the collections, in part formed by Hans Sloan, a physician, naturalist, and collector. During his period of activity in Jamaica, and this is when he started forming his collection, Jamaica, that was the largest colony in the West Indies and whose sugar production relied on the work of a huge population of enslaved Africans and their descendants. Likewise, the creation of a museum of the Republic in the Louvre Palace in Paris in 1793 derived from the French conquest of Egypt, drawing then from the heritage looted from other civilizations. These early institutions were designed indeed to tell the official narratives glorifying great men, including kings, popes, and elite individuals. Now, the museums that emerged in the late 19th century, such as the Museum of Royal Central Africa in Tervuren, now the Africa Museum in Belgium, also drew from the plundering of West Central African populations, a trend that persisted with the rise of European colonialism in Africa. Museums in Britain and France, like the British Museum, the Museum of Trocadéro, that later became the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, the Quai Branly Museum as well, and other museums in the United States, such as the Brooklyn Museum and the Metropolitan Museum. All of them included and still include African artifacts and artworks looted during European wars of conquest in the African continent. Now, between, of course, the 18th and the 21st centuries, what is conventionally called a museum has changed. Ultimately, museums can encompass several definitions, but for the purpose of this lecture, museums are entities managed sometimes by community groups, private organizations, and also the state that promote then the collection, conservation, research, and interpretation of particular dimensions of the history, art, and culture of the societies where they are implanted. In this regard, to different extents, museums of history, art, and culture also act as cultural and educational hubs conceived as instruments that can either prevent or promote social change. Then, like other Western museums, the National Museum's very long history was intertwined with the rise of the Brazilian nation. The museum was housed indeed in the São Cristóvão Palace. And this is an important site in the history of Rio de Janeiro, which has been the capital of Brazil since the middle of the 18th century. And was also, Rio de Janeiro, the largest slave port in the Americas. The palace was located at a place called Quinta da Boa Vista on land first occupied by sugar plantations owned by the Society of Jesus. And following then the expulsion of the Jesuits from Brazil in 1759, the property was divided and distributed to private owners, including a man called Elias Antônio Lopes, who was a wealthy Portuguese slave merchant and politician, who by the early 19th century owned 4 slave ships. Then in 1803, Lopes built a villa on his farm, and in 1808, in exchange for royal favors, he ceded the farmstead to the Portuguese royal family, who had recently arrived in Rio de Janeiro after fleeing the invasion of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Lopes Villa was renovated and transformed into the São Cristóvão Palace, which served then as one of the residences for the royal family during their time in the country. Then when Brazil became independent from Portugal, and this was in 1822, the palace continued to be used as a residence by the Brazilian imperial family. Then the museum itself was created then in 1818 as Royal Museum and opened to the public in 1821. The National Museum was then modeled, of course, after European natural history museums and housed artworks and ancient artifacts donated by the Portuguese royal family. It also had a mineralogy collection and also ethnographic items from different parts of Brazil. Then when Brazil became independent in 1822, the institution was renamed Imperial Museum, and it became National Museum, Museu Nacional, in 1830. In 1892, 3 years after the fall of the Brazilian monarchy, it was when the museum was moved to the São Cristóvão Palace, the building that burned down in 2018. Now, the National Museum relied on an European colonialist view of the world populations. It combined natural history and scientific racism, and its holdings embodied in this spirit of 19th century cabinets of curiosity. It had this rich ethnographic collection that was initially gathered through donations, both from European travelers who spent time in Brazil and also from the Brazilian imperial family. Now, these relationships with non-Western parts of the globe highlight somewhat the delusions of greatness of the Brazilian slavocratic empire. From its inception, indeed, the National Museum held a rich Egyptian collection that at the time of the fire was the largest in Latin America and probably the oldest in the Americas. As records about these items do not indicate how they were collected, we can also we cannot exclude the possibility that several of them were looted. Now, the museum also had a unique ethnographic collection comprising approximately 40,000 items connected to Brazil's indigenous populations. The 19th century French painter Jean-Baptiste Debré largely used these collections to produce the drawings that inspired the lithographs that later illustrated his travel account, Voyage pittoresque et historique au Brésil. Now, this is an account indeed of his 16-year residence in Brazil as part of the French artistic mission. And it's a travelogue that greatly shaped the representations of slavery in museums, but it has an entire volume about the indigenous populations. Now, as with many ethnographic collections of other museums, the acquisition of these artifacts was controversial. Many of the items were obtained then during scientific and ethnographic expeditions in contexts that did not allow native Brazilian communities to give their consent on whether or not they wanted to have these objects collected. In the first decades then of the 20th century, the museum was transformed into a research institution. It also developed important collections in geology, paleontology, botany, zoology, and biological anthropology. Then, in 1946, indeed, the National Museum was incorporated into the University of Brazil, that later was renamed the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in 1965, then Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. And this, the museum then became the home of the university's first graduate program in anthropology, which trained then domestic and also international scholars. Now, to me, as a scholar, as a historian, the most precious objects that were lost when the museum burned down were the 700 items of its Africana collection. It was the oldest and among the largest Brazilian collections of this kind, of its kind. Then several of these objects entered the collections as gifts from an African ruler, West African ruler, but the collection also incorporated items from different parts of the African continent, including then regions that did not maintain any kind of trading or diplomatic relations with Brazil at a time, but that were purchased by private collectors in Europe in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Now, by 2004, what I was doing as a scholar, researcher, I was looking at the relationship between Brazil and the Kingdom of Dahomey during the period of the Atlantic slave trade. And while I was doing research on this, how slavery was memorialized both in Brazil and in former Dahomey, that is present-day Republic of Benin, I became fascinated with the history of King Adonanzan, who ruled Dahomey between 1797 and 1818. During this era of the Atlantic slave trade, the Dahomeyan king Adonanzan clashed with the Brazilian-born slave merchant Francisco Félix de Souza, a story that was richly depicted, of course, it's fiction, in Werner Herzog film Cobra Verde. And you can see here a scene of the film in which Adonanzan is depicted. Now, Adonanzan clashed with the Brazilian merchant Francisco Félix de Souza, and Souza later supported a coup d'etat that removed Adonanzan from power and made indeed his half-brother Gezo the new king of Dahomey. Now, popular memory has represented Adonanzan as the cruelest king of Dahomey, and indeed his name and his symbols, his emblems have been erased from the king's official history. If you see these flags that memorialize each one of the kings, the name of Adonanzan is not there. Now, in 2009, I traveled to Brazil to conduct research in museums and archives then in Salvador, in Bahia, in Rio de Janeiro. And my goal was to explore letters, correspondence between Dahomeyan monarchs and Portuguese rulers as part of existing diplomatic missions that were sent to Dahomey, Portugal, and Brazil, and these missions were intended to negotiate the terms of the Atlantic slave trade. In Rio de Janeiro, I examined a set of letters sent by Adonanzan to Portuguese officials. These letters were housed in the National Library of Rio de Janeiro. They were also in the public archives of the state of Bahia. And also some of these letters were in the Brazilian Historical and Geographical Institute in Rio de Janeiro. And I learned about these letters of the Institute through historian John Thornton. And this was in 2007 while I was in a conference. And then when I went in 2009 to Rio de Janeiro, I went to see these letters transcribed and then transcribe the letters and see what they said about these relations. Also, French photographer and ethnographer Pierre Verger was the first scholar indeed to explore this correspondence, and parts of this correspondence were published in his famous book Flux et Reflux de la traite des nègres au golfe du Bénin. Verger was also indeed the first scholar to identify a number of gifts that King Adonanzan then offered to Prince Regent Dom João Carlos de Bragança, which remained in the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro. But the letters that were there at the Brazilian Historical and Geographical Institute were unique because they included a set of letters that were sent with the embassy, the mission sent by Dahomey to Brazil in 1810. And in these letters, Adonanzan described several of the gifts he was offering to Dom João. And two of these gifts were included in the collection of the National Museum. There were other gifts that were there, but I was interested in two of them. The work then with this correspondence allowed me to explore what was there in the National Museum. And displayed then in the second floor at the time, along with several other Africana artifacts, these Dahomeyan items include a carved wooden throne that you see here, and also a huge pipe holder that you see here. Then my findings connecting these objects with the correspondence were published then in 2012 in a letter that in an article that I published in the journal Slavery and Abolition. But later on, anthropologist Luis Nicolau Parres, he published the entire correspondence in Portuguese, the correspondence that was spread in different archives. And Rio de Janeiro's historian Marisa de Carvalho Soares also started working on the Africana collection and digging more information about these gifts. Now, despite the importance of these gifts and the importance of these collections, the entire Africana collection of the National Museum remained totally neglected. Most of the gifts given by Adonanzan, along with several other African artifacts, were kept in storage facilities, hidden from the visitors. The objects were displayed, as you can see on the picture, in these old-fashioned glass displays without any detailed descriptions to help visitors to understand their history. And the outdated displays mirrored indeed the lack of financial resources available to promote research about the Africana collection and also for redesigning the exhibition. Of course, these problems were not specific to the National Museum. They reflect Brazil's national context, but also the international context in which slavery remained absent from museum institutions. Then, in other words, what I'm trying to do here is to say that all this is not only about the destruction of the building and its precious collections of African objects that documented the exchanges held then during the period of the Atlantic slave trade. I want to take here the burned museum as a metaphor that represents how the history of the African continent and also the history of the Atlantic slave trade remained absent from museum spaces, especially in Brazil. Now, over the last 3 decades, we know that Black social actors, committed curators, public historians, and academics have pushed Western museums to examine slavery and the Atlantic slave trade in their exhibition spaces. Still, we also know that most museums are hardly able to convey the complexities of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. And these complexities were addressed in the Burnett collection of the National Museum that indeed emphasized African agency and also showed how the Dahomeyan rulers engaged with the Portuguese monarchy in their attempts to negotiate better terms for the Atlantic slave trade. This was an exception because in most institutions, sometimes because of the limitations of the existing collections, attempts to provide an overview of slavery and slave systems in general often means to put an excessive attention on victimization. This was not the case in the museum that was destroyed. Now, because the history of many large public and private museums in Europe and the Americas is rooted in violence, most of their permanent and temporary exhibitions continue to this day, ignoring the involvement of their nations in the trade of enslaved Africans. In European museums, we can say that these silences were not dissociated from their failure in addressing the atrocities committed during the colonial rule in Africa. And having neglected any significant, I would say, engagement with Black communities in their respective cities and countries, these institutions often also avoid to address how slavery generated wealth for European nations and how dominant slavery was in the development of colonies and future independent nations of the Western Hemisphere. Now, in this kind of context of silence, erasure, institutions then in Britain, like the Merseyside Maritime Museum in Liverpool, the Museu Náutico da Bahia in Salvador in Brazil, they have briefly depicted the history of the Atlantic slave trade, but always as part of this general history of the British and Portuguese maritime expansion. Then we have several other museums in countries like the United States, France, Portugal, and Spain. Then in these places, they tended to show the history of slavery, sometimes representing it as a benevolent institution, very often trying to emphasize the role of the savior, white abolitionists who emancipated submissive Black subjects. Now, we also had other institutions with modest resources and not much support from professional historians. And these are museums ran by local communities, associations, and cities. And here, for example, in the United States, we have in Maryland, the Sandy Springs Slave Museum. We also have in Charleston, South Carolina, the Old Slave Mart Museum. We have the Slave Relics Museum in South Carolina as well. We have the Slaves Museum in Minas Gerais, in Brazil, and we also have Museu do Escravo, Slaves Museum in Brazil as well. Now, these were among the few institutions that, and very small and with very modest means, that explored this history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, but very often emphasizing victimization. Most of the objects that these places they display are instruments of torture. Now, at the end, in the last decade then of the 20th century, this context started changing. And gradually, the history of slavery made its way into museums in Europe and the Americas. In the 1990s, for example, and this is the turning point, the end of the Cold War accelerated a process that allowed then minority groups to raise their voices and to create connections internationally. This dynamic of globalization promoted much more dialogue among Black citizens around the world through communities, local associations, larger organizations. Then Black social actors, they denounced the persistence of racism and racial inequalities. And in many instances, for example, conferences and international forums led by the United Nations, these social actors, they pushed European, American, and also West African nations to discuss their past involvement in slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. Now, we can also say that West African countries that during the same period, the 1990s, were the countries that were seeking to promote economic development through tourism activities. They also encouraged the memorialization of the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, especially through the promotion of heritage sites and also the creation of monuments and memorials. And we had during this period, and especially during the commemorative dates in Europe and the Americas, a number of initiatives that emerged. In 1988, Brazil celebrated the centennial of the end of slavery. In 1992, several European and American countries commemorated the anniversary then of the arrival of Columbus in the Americas. And in 1994, as part of the development of this context in which these past atrocities were being discussed, UNESCO launched the Slave Route Project in Ouidah, in Republic of Benin. And this was Ouidah was the second largest slave port in West Africa during the era of the Atlantic slave trade. And a few years later, in 1998, France also observed the sesquicentennial of its abolition of slavery. Now, as we entered the 21st century, in May 2001, France became the first European country to enact legislation declaring slavery and the slave trade crimes against humanity. Brazil also passed federal legislation later, making mandatory the teaching of the history of Africa and Africa and Africans, as well as the history of Afro-Brazilian culture in school curricula. And this happened in 2003. Now, at this turn of the 21st century, Britain, as you know, started preparing the commemoration of the bicentennial of the Slave Trade Act 1807 that ended the slave trade in the British Empire. Now, in 2007, then, as you know, many of these, many museums in Britain marked this anniversary with temporary exhibitions and permanent exhibitions as well. The International Slavery Museum was created in 2007. Now, in Brazil, during this period, as I already mentioned, the anniversary of 1988 and also the passing of the legislation to teach Afro-Brazilian history in schools, the situation was changing in Brazil. Then this started changing, especially during the administration of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, when the law of 2003 passed. And it was time then for the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro to come to value and to highlight its collections, telling the history of Africa and the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. In 2007, the Ministry of Education at the time, led by Fernando Haddad, who ran for president in the last elections in Brazil, during his term in the Ministry of Education, we had this rich catalog of the museum that was published. And Brazil, by this time, then by 2010, was already preparing for the FIFA World Cup to be held in 2014. And Rio de Janeiro was preparing to hold then the Summer Olympic Games in 2016. As renovation works were in progress then in the old port area of Rio de Janeiro, as part of a project that was called Porto Maravilha, Wonder Port, the wharf of the Valongo area, the Valongo Wharf, where thousands of enslaved Africans disembarked during the end of the 18th century until 1831, the wharf was rediscovered. And this was a major finding. Archaeologists working in this area collected hundreds of artifacts, such as amulets, pipes, and bones linked to the African populations that were disembarked in this area. And these items were to be examined indeed in the laboratories of the National Museum. In that same year, indeed, the National Museum, this was 2011, started developing a new exhibition titled Kumbu Kumbu, Africa Memory and Heritage, curated by historian Marisa de Carvalho Soares, and this exhibition opened in May 2014. The new room featured at the time about 154 African and Afro-Brazilian objects that were contextualized with explanatory panels. You can see from the displays here the difference between these and the ones with the first photograph that I took of that same throne. Then there was also a book that sort of catalog, explaining and proposing a lot of activities for school children. And this catalog in Portuguese is online, and there will be soon a translation in English. By then, despite these transformations that the museum was going through, the museum was still struggling to attract visitors. To have an idea, about 289,000 Brazilians visit France's Louvre Museum in Paris in 2017, and only 192,000 people visited the National Museum in that same year. Indeed, most of the visitors of the National Museum were low-income individuals, and many of them were Black citizens, especially those disadvantaged students from the public school system who could visit the institution very often for free. Then the National Museum meant different things to different people. To Brazilian and international academics was a shrine in many ways, housing then collections they have been investigating for years, and also a place housing several graduate programs of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. But the building held a special meaning for Brazil's Black population. At the time of the fire, Giovanna Xavier, who is an Afro-Brazilian historian, a public intellectual, and also a professor of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, she told the New York Times that she could still remember visiting the National Museum for the first time when she was just 5 years old. And I quote her, "For many people in my family, it was the first and only museum they ever visited, along with the museum's collection, which is immeasurable. There is the important loss of building historical awareness in children," unquote. Xavier certainly had in mind here the impact of the museum's destruction on Black children. The National Museum was one of the few Brazilian museums to give prominent space to African culture and heritage. And in a racist environment marked by deep racial inequalities, where Black bodies are persistently devalued, low-income Black children who visit the Kumbu Kumbu exhibition, they were provided with tangible reminders of the long history of the African continent and the rich heritage of their ancestors. Then, by engaging the National Museum's collections of World Heritage artifacts, especially then the Luso-Brazilian, African, and indigenous objects, visitors from all kinds, from all walks of life, they could develop this deeper sense of belonging to this complex society that is Brazil, in a place that no other institution could offer them that perspective. Now, the structural problems that were faced by the museum accumulated over several years. At the time of the fire, the main building had a number of problems, including a termite infestation. There were leaking gutters, water infiltration. There was no sparking system, no smoke detector. The smoke detectors existed, but were not working properly when the fire sparked. And in addition to that, of course, there is all the material, the construction material that was used in that building that facilitated the propagation of the fire. Now, because the museum was managed by the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, then it was not financially autonomous, and it had been badly affected since 2014 by federal budget cuts that were decreasing, and the money that was then given to the university. Now, this tragic portrait, as I come to the conclusion, was not unique to the National Museum. All over Brazil, public archives, libraries, and museums housing then precious world history collections depend on public funding and are also at risk and in need of financial support to continue to undertake these renovations. In some cases, Brazilian historians, Brazilian scholars, they personally obtain financial support to safeguard these items and documents. But these individual initiatives, of course, they are not sufficient solution for preserving museum collections and archival documents. More than 2 years then after the disaster, many items were salvaged, but the Africana collection that I showed here and the objects associated with slavery and the Atlantic slave trade were lost. The museum's future then remains uncertain. In October 2018, the far-right candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, won the Brazilian presidential election. And after he took office in 2019, he eliminated the Ministry of Culture and transformed it into a secretariat attached to the Ministry of Citizenship. And then the current government is not only committed to continue neglecting national heritage, but is also committed to destroy what was left of it. Now, despite these blows, The National Museum's administration, the staff as well, gave priority then to the reconstruction efforts to ensure the continuation of the academic programs. And even though international governments and institutions are supporting the reconstruction of the building and the creation of new collections, as scholars, we know that we must accept the reality that the National Museum is gone and can never be replaced. Now, the death of the museum is in many ways also a metaphor of Brazilian society today, in which its cultural institutions are under threat, in where its populations of African descent are not only murdered by police violence promoted by the Brazilian state, but are also now disproportionately killed by COVID-19. Still, as this lecture series has showed, this was not the first institution turned into ashes, and probably is not going to be the last. We may hope that other initiatives will also emerge from this landscape of death and destruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely wonderful lecture. One that really helps us reflect just as the series has done. So it fits right into what we've been seeking to achieve. So thank you very much for that. Reflecting on the complicated history of collecting and there's many things that we can pick up there in terms of, you know, that discussion that you've raised about the origins of museums in loot, but also that other angle that you bring out about their potential for social change, and then the specifics of Brazil. I just think your metaphor of the museum representing the death of the museum representing Brazilian society, that's something that I think resonates much more closely to home, and the culture wars that you're describing are not unfamiliar from much more proximate neighbors and even closer to home. So do remember, please, the lecture is being recorded for Facebook. You can start logging questions in the Q&A and I'll come to them shortly. But first, let me go to our respondent this evening, Laura Joy, who I introduced briefly at the start of the lecture. Laura is the Port Heritage Director at Dublin Port, but also former chair of the Irish Blue Shield and member of the board of the Irish Museum Association, and a former speaker in this series in January 2020. Over to you, Laura.
Peter, thank you very much for the introduction, and hello everyone. It's a privilege tonight to be asked to respond to tonight's lecture. I would like to thank Professor Araujo for her fascinating and thoughtful lecture on the events of the 2nd of September 2018 in Rio, and the impact of the loss of 92% of the collections. And in particular, as we learned, the 40,000 artifacts connected with Brazil's indigenous populations, and a key part of this lecture, the 700 items from its African collections. As the lecture has shown, you know, museums are very much grew up in the 18th century from the cabinet of curiosities, the kind of very much the gentlemen who were returning from their grand tours. And then in the 19th century, as we see in Brazil, they become temples of knowledge for the elite and reflection of their society and how it perceived itself and how it wanted to be represented. And as Professor Araujo has described in her writings, in Brazil, this is very much representing the delusions of grandeur in the case of the Brazilian slavocratic empire. In Ireland, museums in the 19th century grew from those private collections of gentlemen, and in the case of the National Museum of Ireland, from the collections of the Royal Dublin Society and the Royal Irish Academy, opening in 1891, a lot later than in Brazil, as the Dublin Museum of Science and Art. The new Dublin Museum worked closely with the museums of London, Cardiff and Edinburgh, and the new exhibitions highlighted the expanding British Empire. It was very much a British institution, and in particular the decorative arts of Japan, China, and the ethnographic collections, very similar to the ones that we've heard about tonight. Naturally, the emergence of the Irish Free State in 1922 and independence had a dramatic impact on this Victorian institution, and the focus and interest of the now National Museum was on archaeology and Irish history. When we look at museums around the world and the kind of lectures that we've heard over the last 3 years in relation to what happens when museums and archives and libraries are destroyed, the museum sector in Ireland is actually quite small. It consists of about 230 museums. And although we know the big ones like the National Museum and others, the majority, about 60% of them, are private and volunteer run. So the museum sector in Ireland is very, very, very small. And most museums, well over 70% of them, are only responsible for 5,000 objects. So nothing comparable to the wonderful National Museum of Brazil and what we've heard about tonight. And the collections in Ireland are very much focused on history and archaeology and less so on the ethnographic collections. But it was interesting in kind of preparing some notes on this talk that the concerns that were raised towards the end of the lecture there about what the problems that the museum is facing in relation to its stores and its facilities, the impact of termites. In Irish museums and surveys by the Irish Museum Association, 53% of museums identified problems with their stores. And in 35% of museums in Ireland, there's actually a lack of space. So these are concerns that impact on all museums around the world. And it's important that we take them seriously and we do build and make sure that the facilities that we have can survive destruction and in the cases we saw in Brazil, fires and what can happen to them. As we learned during last year's lecture, very much the preparatory professionals have come together to set up the Blue Shield International as a kind of volunteer body similar to the International Red Cross, and to protect our monuments, to protect our institutions and their collections. Blue Shield itself is named after, uses the symbol of the Hague Convention, and it's really through the violence that we saw in the 1990s that this kind of urge to set up an organization to respond to crises, to disasters that affect cultural heritage. And in particular, it's helped to facilitate international responses in the recent world. And Blue Shield, as we learned last year, is very much involved in preparing for disasters and responding to them when they do happen. So I would encourage everyone to keep an eye out for the work that the Irish Committee is doing. It's now chaired by Zoe Reid, Head of Conservation in the National Archives, and you'll find them on Facebook and on Twitter. And they've just completed a 5-year strategic plan, and I'm very, very keen to hear from everyone. In the series over the last 3 years, they've shown very much the impact of disasters, of cultural trauma. And tonight's lecture, we've learned how slavery has been exhibited in museums around the world today, but in particular in Brazil, and the wonderful work that the National Museum of Brazil was doing in that lovely exhibition, the photographs that we saw of exhibiting their African collections before the fire. And as we learned tonight, what happens to priceless collections when they are destroyed and lost. And they're lost to everyone around the world, but in particular, they've been lost to the Black students, as our lecturer has explained, in Brazil. So once again, I would like to congratulate you on a wonderful lecture, and also to congratulate Peter and the team behind Out of Ashes lecture series and the Beyond 2022 project for all your wonderful work, and it's been a fascinating 3 years of lectures, and congratulations.
Thank you, Clark. That's very generous of you and wonderful that you could contribute again. Well, we have questions building up now in the Q&A, including from members of the audience who have visited the museum in the past and are commenting on how sad the events of 2018 are. I wonder if we could start with a question from the director of the Long Room Hub. The Trinity Long Room Hub is directed by Professor Eve Patton from the School of English. And Eve, I think you have a question for our main speaker.
I do. Can you hear me all right?
Can indeed. Thank you. Yeah.
And I want to thank Professor Araujo for a really fascinating talk. And my question is provoked by her very interesting comments on the victim narrative, which can emerge in relation to the collections that she's talking about. And I thought it was such a well-judged insight. But my mind was taken to the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, which I visited some time ago. And one of the things that struck me about the collection there is the arrangement that sets the slavery-related history and artifacts directly beside the history of Black civil rights. And I wonder if she might share my concern that this risks simplifying two historical episodes and in fact homogenizing a Black experience that really deserves a lot more political complexity. So my question is about whether in the efforts to display the experience of slavery and its attendant histories, there is a risk of simplification, particularly in relation to the history of civil rights.
Thank you for your question. It's an important question, and it's a museum, the International Slavery Museum, that I studied and visit several times. I would say that the main problem that happens there, the museum starts in Africa. Then the exhibition, there are 3 galleries. The first gallery focuses on Africa, the second on the Atlantic slave trade, and the last one that is on the legacies. It is important to connect the history of slavery and the legacies, because at the end of the day, that museum emerged from demands from Black citizens to recognize this history. And this history is important not only because of the past, but because of the present of racism and white supremacy, either in a country like Britain or in France or in Brazil and so on. Then the problem with the museum is that it attempts to cover a lot. There was this intention of cover the legacies while also covering slavery, not only in the UK, but then in the former British colonies. And then there is this attempt to cover too much. And then, of course, that for the visitor, we have this impression of immediate continuity between slavery and the civil rights movement, which is, of course, a simplified representation, but with the resources and the space that museum has, we would need 3 times that space at least to be able to tell this history. Of course, there is the history of the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, more than 300 years, and then what happened after, which are the legacies. Then on the one hand, there is this risk of simplification, and I would say that the discourse on victimization is not is much more related to the excessive emphasis on images of victimization, images, also artifacts of torture. This is problematic. But on the other hand, there are museums that are not focusing on the legacies. If you take the example of the Nantes History Museum in the French port of Nantes, it's a spectacular museum, the Museum of History of Nantes, but their exhibition does not address at all the issue of legacies. And to present-day social actors, it is also important. There is a need to connect this history of the past with what was left from this past. Then it's a tricky issue, and I think that most museums to this day, they are dealing with this problem. Few of them are able to solve this issue. Perhaps the museum here in the Washington, D.C., the National Museum of African American History and Culture, is one of these museums to solve this problem, but the space they have and the financial resources they have available is not at hand to any other institution. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that answer. Could I ask, I was struck by as Laura was, by the reimagining of that exhibit in the years just immediately prior to the fire. Was that already attracting government level hostility? Was it part of the culture war even before the fire? And then we have the new government comes in and defunds or just removes the Department of Culture altogether. I mean, can you comment on that? It seems like there's that tension in the cultural landscape is very interesting.
Let me see if I understood. I think that at that point when the exhibition was open, because we need to think in terms of those who visited the museum, most were, they didn't have that huge number of visitors many school children. Then the museum, the exhibition was having a good impact, and I do not know of any reactions that were negative reactions regarding regarding that exhibition. What you can call the so-called cultural wars in the case of Brazil, then first of all is the attack, the physical attack against the populations of African descent by the police, especially also I think that is the Afro-Brazilian religious temples that are attacked by individuals then who are members of these evangelical churches that in Brazil are now very associated with the far right. But otherwise, at that point, it was not necessarily very visible. For example, we have other museums in Brazil that deal with Afro-Brazilian heritage, and then perhaps many people who are not connected to this heritage, they simply do not visit. But the target, I would say, of this new context of what we call cultural wars are the public spaces, especially associated with religion. But it's still, the exhibition had then objects that are associated with African Brazilian religions. But perhaps in the context of a museum, they were not, they were perceived as distant and were not yet, as far as I know, the target of these hostilities.
Mm-hmm. There's some more questions. Thank you very much for that. There's some more questions coming in about aspects of the destruction. So a simple question as to the source of the fire, but also a question from Angus Mitchell asking about the cataloguing in the sense of what was lost. I mean, you described this as an incredibly large collection of about 20 million objects. So to comprehend what was lost must itself be an enormous challenge. Is that something that's underway as part of the recovery process? And related to that, Angus asked, was the National Library also destroyed as well as the artifacts in the museum?
Yeah, the source of the fire, it was then the AC system that is somewhere, then there was an electrical problem, and this was the source, as far as I know. And regarding the catalog, yes, then the museum professionals, they have been doing this work, and the library was also partially destroyed. I don't know exactly details about what was recovered. But there are these efforts. And in terms of the Africana Collection, it's then the Africana Collection is on, there is an initiative by Google that they put, I just can't, I know that is, if you put a National Museum in Google, they have this collection with pictures of high resolution, and this was done with that part of the collection. There were objects that were salvaged, and there are also inventories that were made. Then over time, it's just that I do not think that this entire work is finished at this point. But pretty much then regarding the different collections, we know what was lost and what survived, let's say that way.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I think what we have learned through the project that I'm involved in is the value of that cataloging. I mean, that in terms of any future attempts at recovery, all these attempts to list and into inventory become incredibly valuable for the longer term preservation attempts. The digital component of that, though, strikes me as really interesting. If that's with Google, how will that be preserved in the longer term? You may not know the answer to that, but that strikes me as having its own inbuilt ephemeral dangers that one would want to preserve against, to make sure that digital artifacts also remain within public domain and control. In terms of other questions, there's a question regarding the insurance, whether there was any insurance and what that might lead to. Do you want to comment on that?
I don't have any idea. I would not be able to give an informed opinion about this kind of detail regarding the insurance. But the problem with insurance, as you know, in this kind of context, when there is neglect, it's complicated. And there were many elements that were not there, especially, for example, sparkling system and so on. Then this may be a problem. But the museum had, there was support coming from everywhere in order to recover and to reconstruct. Apparently, the museum is planning to partially reopen in 2022. But it still is a museum that, as an institution, is a public institution, depends on public funding, and unique objects that were lost, they are lost. Then, of course, that as a historian working on particular collections, my interest is about what was lost, and this cannot be recovered. That whatever is the amount of money that an insurance could give to what for the destruction, it's not going to bring back objects like the ones that were unique gifts given to a Portuguese monarch.
Yeah. Well, I think that's certainly a lesson that we've had to learn in an Irish context. No matter how much work we seek to do in terms of recovery, the painful lesson is that enormous amount is lost forever. I thought I saw a question from Zoe Reid, who Lord Joy referred to. Zoe is a colleague of ours through both the Blue Shield in the case of Laura and through Beyond 2022 in my case as a conservator in the National Archives Ireland. Zoe asked how many staff were employed in the museum in 2018 and have those staff managed to remain working there? Do you have any sense of that in terms of the scale of human resources?
I don't know the exact number, hundreds of people. Some of these people who are doing work were associated with the university as well. Then it's hard to say, but there is staff still working. Then the people that you see in the pictures recovering indeed, many of these staff members were those doing manually, putting their lives in risk with the context that was there just after the fire. Even in the night of the fire, they were those who were there. Then it's at the order of hundreds, but it's hard to differentiate those who are connected to the university, for example, yes, and those who are not. And there were people who were also working independently. For example, I mentioned curator Marisa de Carvalho Soares, who curated the exhibition, the Kumbu Kumbu exhibition. She was an invited curator. She was not part of the staff of the museum. Then this is why it's difficult. But of course, I didn't study in detail elements regarding all these details. This is not the dimension that I cover in my work.
Yes, yeah. I think what strikes me is as well as the loss in terms of the cultural heritage, sometimes after a tragedy of this kind, what also gets lost is the social capital, the expertise that's been built up over generations in an institution, and that can be, as important to try and preserve, if anything is to be brought back. Well, I think we have to draw questions to a close at this point. But it's been an absolutely fascinating lecture. I'm just very sorry that we didn't manage to bring you to Dublin in person on this occasion. But as I've said, this general topic that you're bringing to our attention here about the interpretation of the transatlantic slave trade and institutions' involvements in it, that's something that's of live interest in our Trinity context at the moment. And we look forward to finding an opportunity to bring you to Dublin. I also want to thank Lord Joy for remaining so closely involved in the series and for offering a response this evening. to the members of the audience, just to remind you that in just over 2 months, we will have our next and sadly our final lecture in the Out of the Ashes series. It will take place on the 25th of May, which will be the centenary of the Customs House fire in Dublin on the 25th of May 2021. And there will be a research showcase involving the Local Government Archives and Record Managers Association and the Beyond 2022 project that will happen during the day. But in the evening, as the last Out of the Ashes lecture, the curator of the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford, Richard Ovenden, will be speaking with our own Trinity librarian, Helen Shenton. Richard Ovenden is the author of Burning the Books. I have his book here, plug for his book, Burning the Books, subtitled A History of Knowledge Under Attack, which surveys many of the themes that this series has been exploring across the last 3 years. So thank you to you all for attending this evening. Thank you to colleagues in the Long Room Hub for organizing everything so expertly. Thank you to Lar, but most of all, renewed thanks to Professor Ana Lucia Araujo for a wonderful lecture, and we look forward to seeing you in Dublin sometime in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.